Hello, I'm Dr. Ian Ellingham, and in this video episode, I'm going to talk about legibility and familiarity, two key factors that determine why we like some buildings and dislike others. I'm both an academic and a practitioner, meaning that sometimes I actually build things, as well as someone who just enjoys the rich variety of the things that do get built. My goal is to bridge the gap between academic findings and application and make our world just a bit more interesting. How firmly do you hold your beliefs about building design? Strangely, even though design preference is mostly subjective, people tend to be very outspoken and adamant about the opinions that they hold. I'm quite used to being insulted when I contradict someone's design preferences. Let us consider a couple of fundamental matters. Why do we have aesthetic preferences relative to the built environment at all? Charles Darwin explained quite a bit. He was mostly concerned with the physical evolution of the species, but much of his logic applies to behavioral matters, including the reasons why we have design preferences. You have to remember that our species is the descendant of myriads of generations of earlier creatures, going back to single-cell origins. But it's only in the past few thousand years that any hominids, people and people-like creatures, stopped being hunter-gatherers and moved to settled agriculture and animal rearing. Even in our 21st century world, we carry the adaptations that allowed our hunter-gatherer ancestors to survive and pass on their genetic material. Hence, for example, we tend to be risk-averse and wary of things we encounter for the first time. Those hominids who are not wary of the novel things they encountered tended to be eaten by something. In the wild, our ancestors had to find safe places to live, find food and water, and develop their all-important family and social connections. It's remarkable that our mental software, developed when we lived in the wild, serves us so well today when we face very different conditions. Think about something you encounter for the first time. It could be almost anything: a new piece of technology, a new kind of sporting gear, or a piece of kitchen equipment. The first thing your brain will do is try to relate it to something with which it's already familiar. It's entirely logical to fit new things into existing classifications. Is it a bird, or a tree, or a car, or something to eat? The neuroscientists know this process occurs very quickly. After all, you really do need to know whether what you've encountered is likely to be dangerous. Your ancestor did not have much time to jump away from that poisonous snake. So, when you encounter a building for the first time, your brain tries to relate it to something familiar. If it cannot be classified, it's likely to be perceived as ugly, or perhaps avoided or simply ignored, meaning that it is not given more consideration. Familiarity is one major factor that's associated with preference. Yet, as the neuroscientists always find, the brain is a very complex piece of meat and will at times link newly encountered buildings with things other than buildings. One of my favorite stories is of a young lady who, expressing esteem for a rather unusual building used in one of my experiments, upon some reflection told me she thought she had linked the pattern on the building with a favorite pair of shoes. She liked the shoes, so she liked the building. But this is probably unusual, and most people will be relating newly encountered buildings to buildings already encountered. Architectural awards programs often include a people's choice element, where members of the wider public vote for various buildings. Historic buildings and renovations do very well in these, because they're familiar, or at least have familiar forms. One might also pay attention to the products of the suburban house builders, because they're responding quite directly to their marketplaces. And their products often offer visual connections to familiar building forms. And, of course, what is familiar will vary from culture to culture. As the brain attempts to assess a newly encountered building quickly, it's important that the building can be read by the brain. This means it has to be quickly understandable. It cannot confuse the viewer. The viewer has to be able to make sense of it. I was the development consultant for a multi-unit residential building I personally esteem very highly, as do the people living in it. I find its street presentation to be thoughtful and interesting. Yet, in one of the major local newspapers, it was called one of the ugliest buildings in the city. And in my own experiments with a wide variety of respondents, this was found to be a widely held sentiment. What's going on? Firstly, the building was created and occupied by the members of an ethnic group who can relate it to the architecture of their homeland. And it's the architecture as they remember it, or they imagine it to be, not necessarily as it actually is today. It's already their mental interpretation of the architecture. Other people without that background will tend to see it as ugly or simply confusing. The building has a very complex exterior with various planes and curved surfaces and subtle detail. But there's another group, and that includes the local neighbors and myself. The building has become familiar in itself. I suspect not everyone in the area consciously or unconsciously understands the design itself, but it's simply something they expect to see there. Familiar for its presence, if not for its characteristics. We do know that some buildings were originally rejected by most people, and they've come to be widely esteemed. Assuming this will happen for any specific building is a very risky strategy, because this sort of familiarity takes time to develop and may never happen. The units in my project are targeted at a group that recognized and esteemed its design. It might have initially had a more difficult time in the marketplace, in a wider marketplace. This leads us to some rules, although perhaps guidelines is a better expression. As in the design world, there tends not to be hard and fast rules, and things are definitely not independent of each other. However, decades of research and thought tends to suggest that legibility is increased if a set of characteristics is kept in mind. First is a limited palette of materials. 2 or 3 plus glass seems to be reasonable. If you can count more than 5 or 6 in a building, people are likely to be confused. On one building I counted over 10. And the appearance of that particular building is generally not esteemed in its community. Simplicity. This means easy to understand forms. Now I know some of you will disagree and point to esteem buildings that are very complex, but usually these have very limited numbers of materials, sometimes just one. And here's an example of a building with a fairly complex form, but it only has one exterior material and glass. Not too many different forms. Too many forms make it difficult to associate with things the viewer has previously encountered. Mixing dissimilar elements together in one building is usually not a good design strategy. Define lines, textures, and edges, so the viewer does not have to guess at the forms. Now, these factors will tend to make a building legible. They will not necessarily make a building esteemed, but if the building is illegible, one can be reasonably sure it will not be regarded very highly by people who are not already familiar with it. So that's a starting point in understanding how and why people respond to buildings and the way they present themselves. Familiarity and legibility effectively come together. If a building is not readily comprehensible, it's likely the brain will not be able to make decent associations. In the next videos, we'll look at other factors that are integral to the way we assess buildings and other environments.